Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Omri Johnson, your host. I hope you're well. Join me as we continue to deconstruct the shortcomings of traditional DEI strategies and co-create a vision for more transformative, human-centered approaches to inclusion. Myself and my esteemed guests will challenge the status quo, dive deep into the reactive, supplemental nature of many DEI initiatives. We'll explore how to reclaim the profound and transformational potential of inclusion as a catalyst for collective growth, empowerment, and organizational change. Season 2 of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast starts now. Hello, welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Omri Johnson. I'm your host, and I'm excited to have Ashanti Bentil-Dhue, who I met, I guess it's about a year and a half ago. And Ashanti interviewed me, and I just remember how thoughtful the questions were. And then I remember back there now, like, they weren't just thoughtful, they were strategic. And so now that I see what Ashanti's up to now, I'm super excited. Ashanti's been in the DEI space. She's trained in a lot of different things. She's a trained, or maybe recovering lawyer. And I won't go into too much depth about recovering lawyers, but just the way you see the world, Ashanti, it's refreshing, and I appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So welcome, Ashanti.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel really honored to be invited on to have a chat with you and share with your community.
I'm looking forward for them to hear more from you. I think we have some overlap in our communities. So before we jump into the heart of the conversation, Ashanti, please share a couple things. A favorite song or movie that you go to over and over again. And then the second question is a book or a person that's influenced and or inspired you personally or professionally in your life or career journey.
Absolutely. So probably, it's a great question about a song or a movie. And this may actually sound a little bit dark, but probably one of my favorite movies is Taken. I know it's a little bit dark, but that is one of my favorite movies. And well, actually, it's probably not surprising as we go on to have this conversation. But that's my favorite movie, probably. And then also a book. I'd say more recently, a book that really has activated me in the business of my life is Be Your Future Self Now. And that's written by a gentleman called Dr. Benjamin Hardy. And that book is really about how you see yourself in your best self and how you become that person now. So rather than making plans based on the past, you make plans based on that person you want to be.
I love it. I love it.
It's a very good book, really quite practical, and it absolutely turns much of what we are taught as human beings, particularly if you've been a part of a religion or certain cultures. It really turns a lot of those beliefs and paradigms on their head about what we're capable of and what we have a right, what we can give ourselves permission to want in life.
I love it. Wow. Powerful. That's the beginning of our conversation. I can only imagine. Is Taken where Liam Neeson yells, "Give me back my son"? That line's in my head like forever. That's one of his iconic lines. I mean, forget about Schindler's List. Let's go to that one. Okay. So Ashanti, share about your background with the audience, who you are in parallel with your work and what you're working to create and are creating in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So my formative career was in legal and financial compliance. So I basically was trained to be an adjudicator between financial institutions and their customers, and those could be corporate customers as well as individual consumer customers when there were financial disputes. And my main job really was to understand what the regulations were from the financial regulator and tell the bank how they could comply with those regulations when it came to creating financial products for their customers. And so we would hold them accountable, essentially, the banks and financial institutions. And later on, once I'd mastered that, I went to work in-house at financial institutions to help them avoid being fined in the first place.
Sure.
When they develop these products and financial services. So that's really my formative career. And that obviously taught me a lot about what we do now and the importance of having some type of regulation when you have markets that are significantly made up of independent individual providers, consultants, brokers, etc.
It sounds like you move from remediation to prevention. And that as an epidemiologist, I'm always about how can we prevent something from happening rather than wait till it falls off a cliff and probably try to hope we can catch it or lessen the blow, sometimes too late. You're in the process. And I think when we first started talking about kind of the DEI space and where things were going, we were really right after, I think I met you not long, probably in 22. Floyd, the conversation about George Floyd was really kind of on its way. And you were talking about this notion of clear competencies and a framework for DEI and workplace equity. And I think you were talking about this before the storm, but after the storm, the storm being post-Floyd, it was a really different space that I imagine you found yourself in. What led you to take such a massive endeavor on, given all the certificate programs? And I mean, I think there was new ones every week right after George Floyd was murdered. Yeah. What had you take this on before, and how has it accelerated after?
It's a really good question. I think, again, probably because I have that compliance mindset and way of looking at what we do. And I think this also goes to a core issue for me about value and integrity and return on investment. Because ultimately, in this DEI market, organizations predominantly are the ones paying for this work. And so when you think about it right now, if they don't get what they expect or were promised, there's nowhere for them to go. There's no ombudsman, no body that they can go and say, hey, this didn't really work for us, or this didn't turn out very well. And what I was noticing as a practitioner running a DEI business is that I was, and I've always proudly been okay with it, I was often the third or fourth choice. But the interesting thing about being the third or fourth choice, being somebody who's not an award-winning DEI practitioner, who hasn't written a book, who isn't a top LinkedIn voice, does not have hundreds of followers on LinkedIn, is that organizations were coming to me after they've tried something once or twice. And so I was able to see the outcomes of them choosing to work with providers really because of vanity metrics initially, not asking them the right questions and not knowing what to ask in order to identify whether or not they were working with competent providers or professionals. Now, that meant there was a lot of unlearning we had to help our clients do. It meant we had to do a lot of clear up, particularly when it comes to healing, discord, disappointment, building trust again, helping stakeholders. Also, this is something people don't really think about. There's their reputations on the line. If you are that hiring manager or the head of HR and you have chosen to work with this provider and it doesn't work well, it's not great for your own reputation. So I was finding that before we could even get into the work, I was doing a lot of work with them before we could get back round to the DEI strategy. And so I decided to take a chance, really, and fund some research into competency in the DEI industry. I wanted to understand, where are people getting their skills from? Where are they sourcing their material from when working with organizations? How do we actually know who to work with? And that's what led us down this road. So 4 years later, we now have been able to develop a competency framework that organizations can use when hiring providers or professionals.
That's beautiful and very necessary. There were quite a few new practitioners. I'd say I don't want to use anything that's negative. As my audience knows, I never say anything bad about DEI practitioners, but a lot of people rushed in. And how has that impacted either the urgency of what you were working on or the mission as the post-Floyd practitioners rushed in pretty rapidly and not in my opinion, in a way that we could make sense of or monitor? Like how's your work been impacted by that?
So that's a good question. That influx of consultants basically gave me an opportunity to have a sitting, sample set to go out and survey. So that's what I did. We ran a number of surveys. As you know, we interviewed over 100 professionals and consultants and asked them about competency specifically. What does it mean to them? How do they create competency in their own practice, etc.? So it actually was the perfect storm for the research phases, because I didn't want to just go on a hunch. I really wanted to make sure we had accurate primary data that we could start working with. And then we also obviously did that secondary data research to see what was already out there in terms of maybe other certifications, accreditations, and even any other research papers that talk specifically about the skill level of a DEI professional. And of course, there was only one white paper, which is about 12 years old, which looked at this anyway.
Wow, one?
Yeah, one.
Wow, that says a lot. It says a lot about us as practitioners too. And obviously, I've come across several researchers that are doing well, that have done good work in the space.
Yes.
But the competency aspect was totally untapped, it sounds.
Yes, and part of that is because of the paradigms and the beliefs that this work is currently based on. Because the current belief is that knowledge level about different topics, specifically bias, systemic inequality, white supremacy, is competency. So all of those research papers and a lot of the content out there is all focused on that. And so I think that people just assume, therefore, everybody's competent if they can tell you what bias is, if they can tell you what systemic inequality is. But of course, that's not the case actually at all. Knowledge about these particular topics are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of workplace DEI competency.
Yeah. It brings me to something that D.H. Lawrence said. He said, knowledge is to consciousness like the signpost to the traveler. It's an indication of what's been traveled before, but it's not an indication of what is and what's possible. I'm paraphrasing and embellishing a bit, but that's what that came to mind. So you started putting the research together. You hadn't said anything about the center. When I found out, and when you finally got the website up and you're talking more about the center on social media, I was like, wow, this is so incredibly powerful. Let's talk about the center and talk about the principles that you're bringing to this work. One of those principles is neutrality.
Yeah.
And, it's been, because I kind of gravitate toward it. I try not to be biased in going there, but I just threw it into the questions anyway. Yeah. But I'm curious about the neutrality principle, but other principles that the center is trying to bring forth as you bring really competencies to the fore.
Yeah, absolutely. So the leading with neutrality competency is probably one of the most provocative, because it is the most, probably at the moment, disruptive in the industry as it stands, because most practice of DEI is steeped in social justice, politics, and identity work, i.e. who we think we are and how important we think that is, right, to everybody else. And the leading with neutrality competency is about taking a non-political approach to workplace DEI. And what that means, therefore, is that if social justice and politics becomes a part of your practice, it needs to be done selectively and only when appropriate. But your practice is not based in that. And similarly, when it comes to identity, and I always say, if you're saying I, me, my, when you are consulting, advising, training, then you're not leading with neutrality.
Ooh, Ashanti. What? Wait. But what about lived experience? Because
Mm,
that's the kind of seemingly gold, but sometimes it feels a bit like fool's gold, but seemingly gold standard for many,
yes.
particularly in the critical social justice space. So
Yes.
go a little deeper here because
Yeah.
I got a feeling some people are going to be like,
Yeah. Well, and this is really interesting because I did a lot of research actually around lived experience and how other industries approach lived experience in terms of practice, whether it's therapy, therapeutic practice, psychology practice, and a lot of kind of social impact practices out there, and how lived experience is dealt with. Lived experience is not a competency, and there's so many reasons why, which we see in practice when we start looking at outcomes organizations are getting. So the first thing is in the workplace, you're looking at organizational strategy, which for those who may not be clear, that takes in organizational health and change. Therefore, you cannot build an organizational strategy on one lived experience, a narrow, singular lived experience, or the collection of narrow, singular lived experiences. This is one of the key differentiators between workplace DEI work and social justice. In the workplace, we are looking at that organization. And when we're looking at that organization's workforce, we cannot build the DEI strategy off of lived experience. And we certainly cannot build it off of the lived experience of the practitioner or in-house DEI professional. That doesn't work, practically speaking, logistically. In addition to that, what you tend to find with people who are attached to lived experience being a significant factor in practicing DEI is that we often assume that someone with lived experience, one, recognizes that they have lived experience of prejudice and discrimination. I don't know about you, Amri. I can't tell you the number of organizations I've worked with where in the senior leadership team or management team, there will be an individual of color, of a different sexual orientation, who will tell you that they've never experienced discrimination or prejudice in their career. Now, there are various reasons as to why they might say that, but their colleagues are assuming that they have. So if we're selecting people on the basis of that's again a nonsense. It's a no-go. In addition to that, we do see many individuals who would be classified as coming from an underrepresented group or a marginalized group who are just as toxic, unethical, unhealthy in their workplace behavior as anybody else. So again, we can't solely choose professionals and providers based on whether or not one of the trainers, the consultants is bisexual or has a disability. That doesn't speak to competence in a workplace setting at all. At all. And I often say to people, like, I've had a wound for 35 years, but I can't rock up to the local hospital and say, look, let me help you deliver some babies for the morning. You know what I mean? And so we need to be more critical. We need to use some critical thinking around this belief that lived experience is a significant factor that speaks to the competence of that DEI professional or the provider that you might be working with.
no, it's brilliant. And I just wrote a Substack about an experience I had on Twitter in 2019 where they were doing the Harriet Tubman movie and they were doing all the promotion of it, and they were talking about the consultant team, and somebody online said, oh, they have a white woman who is the consultant. And I looked her up and I was like, man, this woman is amazing. Like, how many people have studied Harriet Tubman or African-American history with this level of depth, worked with Skip Gates? Like, she was one of the best at it in the world.
Yes.
And they were like, oh, she's a white woman and she can't talk about, Harriet Tubman's experience. And I was like, well, I asked the simple question. I said, well, is she qualified? And an influencer on social media, on Twitter, I guess this is what Black Twitter was. I was ignorant. I hadn't been on Twitter that much for a long time. And I heard about Black Twitter. It was kind of like, oh, there's Black Twitter. But if I Google it, but it said that, and the person responded, did you say, is she better? And I was like, no, 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 no. I said nothing about better.
Exactly.
And it was a little bit of it was very much a clear strategy because it automatically, the stuff flooded my notifications, people going after me personally, like I had violated some like cardinal rule. And I was like, what? Like I asked a simple question. If you look this woman up, who's better at this, And don't you want it to be accurate? Don't you want it to be robust? Don't you want to have a movie that you are excited to watch? It didn't matter.
Yeah.
And they took me to task. Now, I'm telling that story because for those of that don't know or haven't seen the pictures of the people that I interview, Ashanti is a woman of African descent.
Yeah.
Right. And for many women of African descent, that's the lead conversation as DEI practitioners. What you're saying is, yeah, I'm just as proud to be a woman of African descent as I've always been. And that is not something I can lead with where competencies are concerned.
It doesn't qualify.
How do you rectify that?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's not a true requisite. It's not an automatic qualifier. And I can say, as somebody who, when I was building the business in the early years, as I said, I was second, third, fourth choice for a lot of organizations. And when we would ask to look at what they'd done so far, and I would look at the content of the training and the reports that were handed to them, most of this stuff was made up of social memes, personal anecdotes, personal stories. Unacceptable. That is not competent practice. That's not competent practice. Now, I'm not there by saying, because I think you said something really interesting there, is people, you said, is she qualified? And what the person hears and processes is better. And the two aren't the same thing. So whilst when I talk about lived experience not being a competency, people hear me saying white people can do this work better, or they should do this work. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is regardless of your identity and your lived experience, we need to be competent in this work. Doesn't matter what your identity is. It doesn't matter what your lived experience may or may not be. Ultimately, it doesn't matter.
But I wasn't trained to do the work with that idea. I didn't even really get it until like the critical social justice conversations kept emerging. And I think when I was inside, I had blinders on. When you're inside of an organization, you can lose touch with the so-called real world. And so there was lots of stuff that just passed me by over a 9-10 year period, trying to really create the work and create the conditions for people to thrive inside of the organization I was a part of.
Yeah.
And so when the social justice kind of lived experience dynamic came out as, a proxy for competence,
yes,
it actually confused me because I'd never practiced like that. And sometimes I would talk to organizations that if I didn't talk like that, they were like, well, who is he? He doesn't know what he's doing. It doesn't matter that I've been doing this for, over 3 decades. It was just like, well, what, you got to talk about this. This is where we are right now. And I was like, okay, we probably aren't a good fit.
Yes.
Right. And as similar to you, some of those folks came back to me later.
Yes.
And they came back and saying, we're getting pushback. Okay. Why are you getting pushback? What capabilities or competencies were you trying to move forward in your folks so that they can manage the similarities and differences, complexity day in and day out?
Yes.
And what I'm hearing from you is that's where we need to go. And I want to hear a little bit more about that, your vision. What does the DEI landscape of the future look like? What will we be doing more of or less of or differently, let's say in 2026 or beyond?
Yeah, exactly. Well, what I think we need to see, because for again, it might be useful for your community. There are a lot of push and pull factors happening right now that are wider than the kind of vacuum that a lot of DEI professionals exist within. The US is already seeing, for example, laws being passed that impacts to a certain extent the way DEI is currently done. In the UK, for example, we have a government who's already said that it would like to investigate what diversity consultants actually do and get paid for. there are push and pull factors whereby the DEI industry is being asked to be accountable and more transparent about the value it actually adds, not the discord and division people feel it creates. And so what we need to do as a DEI industry is actually be at the forefront of creating more accountability, transparency, and yes, regulation. There is no other industry that escapes scrutiny. And so ours will not be any different. If you look at health and safety, for example, here in the UK, it was in the 70s that those regulations and laws came in. But now in the workplace or any building, quite frankly, we walk into, whether it's a coffee shop or if we're going to buy some hardware, we wouldn't think twice if we saw water on the floor and we didn't notify someone that the floor's wet so they can put the cone up and everyone knows that there's water on the floor. We know now how to put a ladder up against the wall. And the reason why I draw that parallel is because DEI professionals feel that this work is just as life-saving as health and safety is, right? And we do not demonize health and safety officers, facilities officers in the way we demonize HR directors and CEOs. And so what we need to do is be on the forefront of leading that accountability as an industry in terms of here's what we do, this is the value it adds, and this is how we hold each other accountable to that. So that's what I would love to contribute to is creating more regulation in the industry. And what people often forget is, well, there is a whole crop of new and aspiring professionals, DEI professionals. I get DMs from people leaving university all the time who want to do this work, but there's no established career pathway. If they want to become a doctor or anything else, there are ways of being moderated, regulated, peer reviewed, as they develop in their skills and practice. And that doesn't exist in DEI. So what I'd like to see is that we introduce some type of global standard approach to practice of DEI in the workplace only. This isn't about in society or anywhere else, but in the workplace. And secondly, what I would like to see is that if you've been practicing anything less than 3 or 4 years, the question becomes, why haven't you gotten yourself accredited? Not why haven't you? Because the era we're living in now is much different to 5 years ago, 10 years ago. The coaching industry has gone through this revolution, right? There's now 3 international coaching bodies for those who want to be coaches. And DEI should be no different, considering most DEI professionals want to be paid for this work, whether they're independent or in-house. And I'm sure you do, I see a lot of conversation about the fact that this should attract a 6-figure salary. But you're self-taught. You are completely self-taught. There is no other profession that you could go into a workplace and demand a 6-figure salary when all you've done is go to a few webinars, you feel hard done by because of your own personal experience. No. So, we do need to be far more pragmatic with one another and hold each other more accountable.
I think the mirror holding that you believe you're doing as a practitioner when you go into an organization has to start with yourself.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people come in thinking they're holding up the mirror and so-called speaking truth to power, and that's kind of their shtick, but they haven't done their own work. And I think that with the competencies, you can assure that you've done the baseline minimum, then you could accentuate it and build on it. It's like you have the bones, or the architecture, the foundation, the structure of competencies, and then you hang your experiences and your narratives that you develop with clients or on that, including your use of self. I think use of self is a construct that's been around in the OD space for a while, but it wasn't just lived experience, Gestalt and things like that have been really robust and rigorous.
Yes.
And you have people with PhDs that teach it, that have been doing it for decades, right?
Yeah.
That's who I've learned it from, right? But you can't just say your lived experiences, your story that you had somebody made you feel bad because you thought that they said this because you were Black. Like you weren't sure if they did it because you were Black, but you're pretty sure because that's the way the world works, is that if you're Black and the people do stuff to you, it's because you're Black.
Right.
I don't think it's helpful. I think it lacks space for agency, but I know that's the way a lot of practitioners go about it. What's your conversation with people? What's the pushback you're getting from
Mm.
some practitioners who are like, who are you, Ashanti?
Yeah.
I've seen your rigor. So I'm like, I ain't asking her that because she'll just drop it on me and tell me all the stuff she's done. And I've been watching it. But others are like, how do you know? And I'm like, all right, what do you say to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the main three things probably that come up are one, and often I realize it's not really about me. This is often about the lack of trust people have, one in themselves, but also in some of the existing educational offerings out there. So one of the main questions I often get is why another certification? That's the first question. And then why do we need to pay for it? Which is very interesting because what you're colliding with there is people's own money stories as well, because ultimately all development requires some level of investment, period. So I understand often it's their own money stories that are coming forth there. Also, I think that there's a kind of flawed belief that because DEI work is about being accessible and inclusive, therefore things should be free. That's not what inclusion is. That's not what accessibility is, but there is that belief there. So I'd say it's usually around why can I trust this certification and why does it need to be paid for? I'd say those are the top two things. And the third thing I think is that people have become comfortable. They're comfortable operating as they are now. And because quite frankly, there hasn't been a consequence of not getting accredited.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, organizations are still paying people. People still get hired. And so there is a belief, therefore, that this is okay and things will stay this way. And as I said, the research is showing it's not going to stay that way. At some point, we are going to be scrutinized as an organization, as an industry rather, in terms of, well, who's competent and who is not to do this work.
I totally agree with that. I think that's to me, it's one of the biggest opportunities we've ever had in the history of this work, because I came into this following some people that I think are heavy hitters and have done really excellent things in organizations. Some of them aren't with us anymore, like Dr. Roosevelt Thomas. They were on the forefront of this, and they actually made real change on multiple levels, and their fees were nothing in comparison to what the companies got in return.
Yes.
And so like you can command those fees when you have that level of depth, but you shouldn't feel entitled, talk about privilege. If you think you're supposed to get something because you look a certain way or you can say a few things that have been commoditized on the internet, think again.
Well, absolutely. I mean, don't even get me started on the conversations I see around charging organizations more because of the microaggressions you might experience while you're delivering your service. Absolute nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Charging more because you are Black and because you've experienced racism in the world at large. Now that you're doing this work, you should charge an organization more. All of this is unethical. It continues to undermine the value of our profession. There was no other service that you'd go in and say, I'm charging you more, quite simply because of what I've experienced over the course of my childhood and in broader society. And what annoys me, obviously, is I see people liking these posts, adding fuel to the fire in your commentary. The fact of the matter is when you are delivering a service to a corporate organization in exchange for money, the real important thing is what is the transformation? What is the value of that transformation to them? It's not about you. It's a really bad practice. It's a really bad attitude for us. And I say us because we're in the industry, but we should be passing that on to the next generation. Professionals. It's absurd.
If they're responsible.
Exactly. And also, I also see people talking about, I charge, I don't know, they'll say I'll charge £10,000 for training. And other people say, I never thought to charge that before. Meanwhile, again, they've only just started doing this work. And so, no, it's so important for us to remain above the fray ethically as professionals, because organizations will not take us seriously. This is one of the reasons why governments can pass regulations and laws that says you can't do anything even similar to this in your organization, because they can't take us seriously.
Yeah. I mean, you just hit on something that I think we haven't talked about.
I've seen some academics, I've been trying to be quiet about it, but some of my friends like, don't go there, Omri, they'll cancel you. And I'm like, well, maybe they will, but look, I'm seeing some of the academics that are pushing back on the pushback to DEI, but they're just doing it with more rhetoric.
Yes.
It has no depth or no kind of nuance to it. It's just like, well, let me tell you what research I've done, which is a lot of the DEI research is heavily biased.
Yes.
And it's full of confirmation bias where they're asking questions toward what they really want to find.
Yes.
And the thing is about racism, if you look hard enough, you'll find it. Even if it's not racism, it just could be kind of appear as such, And it infuriates me. And these people are mega popular. And they've written books, and I've read some of their books. Some of them are horrible, but I've read them because I was like, I really want to support this person. I really want to get to the depth of understanding of why is everybody like into this?
Yes.
And I can't figure it out. When I talk to you, I'm like, oh, this is both passion for doing something at the highest level and reason to say, why are we doing this? And it's not for me. It's not for how I feel. It's not for my ancestors that were enslaved. It's for this organization that's paying me to deliver something excellent to help them create the conditions for their people and their organizations to be great. Yeah. And otherwise, there's no point to it.
No, and this is the thing. It's like, first of all, and this is something that it's funny, because when I talk to the senior teams and our clients, they're like, I can't believe you just said that. I said, as an employer, it's not your responsibility to right the wrongs, one, of the world, and two, of your employees' whole lives. Some of these employees, their parents haven't been good parents. They don't have great friends. They were failed in the education system. That is all true. But you as an employer don't have to change or rewrite all of that. That is not your responsibility. And I think the problem is the DEI industry has kept broadening out the responsibility of an employer. I just recently, actually, someone contacted me who described themselves as a fat activist who helps organizations reduce bias against fat people in the workplace. Now, respectfully, that's not workplace DEI. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not true that larger bodied people experience discrimination at work. But my point is, there has to be some reasonable parameters around what we're asking employers to actually do. And this work is not an opportunity for you to get free therapy, unbridled therapy as the DEI professional. It's not acceptable. It's not ethical. And so we have to look, that's the whole point of the center existing. Some of this stuff is unpopular because it smacks in the face of what has been taught, the stuff that tickles people's ears, that makes them feel all warm and fuzzy. But actually, this is a business transformation. DEI in the workplace is a business transformation.
You mean it's not changing hearts and minds?
I mean, can you tell me what qualification would allow you or enable you to do that anyway? I'm often wondering, where did we all go to study to change hearts and minds? And also, there's a certain level of arrogance that we who are self-elected DEI professionals have the right and the ability to change hearts and minds.
What?
Again, not our responsibility, not our job. And quite frankly, to ask employers, people managers, CEOs to also want to do the same, this doesn't track.
This is one of the most honest conversations I've had with somebody who considers themselves a practitioner of this work. And we need more of your honesty, Ashanti, and I appreciate it. So we're moving towards our time. What have I not asked you that you think would be helpful to this audience? What questions should I have asked that I didn't?
Wow, what a question. I think one of the important things that could be useful to share with individuals to contextualize is that this is an unregulated market. Over 90% of the providers and professionals are self-taught. And this market is going to be worth about 30 billion in 5 years' time. Organizations are still spending money on this. And we have a responsibility to make sure they have a return on investment, not a return on expectation. And so this is why this is really important. And if you really are serious about being a DEI professional that is trusted, then you will want to come to understand what the 13 core competencies are and look at whether you are mastering those in your practice.
Lovely. So tell us where people can find the center, where they can find you,
Yes.
how they could connect. Anything else you think we should know about you and your work?
Well, the Competence Center for Workplace Equity, we are always publishing the research because competency is a bare minimum and it should be open source. And so if you go onto our website, which will probably be in the show notes, you'll be able to go and read the research if you wish to, but equally we do have a handy booklet that just outlines what the 13 core competencies are, how they were identified. And I can really assure you, these are peer-reviewed, data-backed research. They're not from a singular narrative. I know I'm the one sharing them today, but it wasn't my work. All I have done is merely hopefully provided a platform for these 13 core competencies to emerge and be shared with the wider industry.
Fantastic. Ashanti, this has been such a delight. I am hoping to bring you back as this center continues to expand, and so that people can hear about this. And I would say, personally, I've been doing this a long time. When I read through the competencies, I said, you know what? There's places where I can upskill. And so I'm definitely going to be one of your certified people at some point. So I'm excited to continue to learn with you, and I appreciate what you're bringing to the world, to the work, and it's so desperately needed. And I think it will probably be one of the bright lights that keeps DEI really doing what it can do and what I got into it for. And it sounds like we got into it in a similar way.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, folks, I hope that was helpful, and continue to subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our Reconstructing Inclusion Substack, and of course, follow me, Omri Johnson, and our guests like Ashanti Bentil-Dhue. Make it a great day. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.